Language and style. After reading the predecessors of Shakespeare, including the greatest of them, Christopher Marlowe, the works of Shakespeare himself, we mean, of course, the English script, are striking in the number and variety of words. The great playwright threw open the doors in front of the living speech of his era. At the same time, he borrowed a lot from the exquisite poet Edmund Spenser, the fanciful writer and playwright John Lyly, and other representatives of the aristocratic, magnificent Renaissance. The combination of elegant, painted language with a living element of colloquial speech and is primarily a characteristic feature of the Shakespearean style. For more details, see my work, The Language and Style of Shakespeare, in the collection, From the History of English Realism, published by the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, M.L. 1941. The language of Shakespeare in the original is extremely difficult. This difficulty is due not to the fact that this language has become obsolete. We easily read not only many of Shakespeare's contemporaries, but also many of his predecessors. For example, the first of written in the English language of tragedies, Gorboduc 1552, can easily be read already in the third year of learning English. The difficulty of Shakespeare's language lies, first, in that, as we have already said, he, apart from the book language, widely used the living language of his time. Secondly, the language of Shakespeare can be compared with a lot of small mirrors, which reflected the surrounding reality, in its detailed features, we sometimes unknown. Good wine does not need a bush, says Rosalind at the end of the comedy, How You Like It. All the words are familiar to us. But in order to understand this phrase, the commentators need help. They explain to us that in that era, instead of written signboards, read by a few people above the doors of wine shops, they hung a bunch of branches called a bush. Good wine does not need a sign, advertising. That is, a good comedy it does not need an epilogue. That's the meaning of Rosalind's words. When we study the text of Shakespeare, we face difficulties at every step. Meanwhile, during the life of the great playwright, no one considered him a dark writer. Plays it, if their language was dark, could not go in public theaters. Only at the beginning of the 18th century did it become necessary to comment on Shakespeare's plays. Although Shakespeare's dictionary is significantly richer than the dictionary of his predecessors and reaches an impressive figure of over 20,000 words, he is undoubtedly much inferior to the dictionary of some realists of our time. Even an insignificant writer, generously detailing the facts of the surrounding reality, especially a writer inclined to naturalism, can easily overtake Shakespeare in this respect. It would not be surprising if, in the calculation, it turned out that Ben Jonson's dictionary exceeds Shakespeare's dictionary by the number of lexical units. The wealth of Shakespeare's language lies not so much in the number of words as in the vast number of meanings and shades in which Shakespeare uses the word. Shakespeare can be compared to a musician who extracts from the instrument unexpected wealth and a variety of sounds. It often happens that the word is used by Shakespeare simultaneously in two or even several meanings. Dying King John, historical tragedy, King John says, "I'm asking for cold consolation." This, first, means that the king asks for a small, if not indifferent, participation in his sufferings. Secondly, that he physically yearns for the cold, for his insides burn from the poison he has received. Thus, the word here simultaneously lives in both figurative and in its direct material meaning. All this served and serves as a grateful ground for the disputes between Shakespearean commentators about the meaning of a word in this context. Often, it turned out that the dispute resolved the scene. The best commentator was the actor. The word of Shakespeare needs not only to read, but also to hear. The great playwright wrote primarily for the stage. So the syntax of Shakespeare, which sometimes seems confused and untidy, is that this syntax of impulsive speech, according to the apt comment of one researcher, acquires harmony and clarity when the text of Shakespeare is not read with the eyes, but is pronounced from the stage. A particularly characteristic feature of Shakespeare's style is the saturation with imagery. Every word he has, a picture, noted the English poet Thomas Gray about Shakespeare. The materiality of the images, to which the writers of the Renaissance were generally inclined, is expressed in Shakespeare with particular strength and completeness. Othello does not say that Desdemona greedily listened to his stories, but that she devoured his stories with a greedy ear. Instead of sour expression, Shakespeare will say vinegar expression. Instead of sweet words, sugared words. Shakespeare's imagery is often associated with a gesture. Donald Byrne, Macbeth, expressing the idea that in the pretentious smiles surrounding threatening threats, says, "In the smiles of people, daggers." The actor who played on the stage of the Globus Theatre himself demanded a gesture, a raised and compressed hand, as if holding the dagger. "Shut up the ears of my house, I want to say, shut the windows," Shylock says to his servant, and the words themselves suggest actor gesture. Movement attracted Shakespeare stronger than the color and shape of the object. "The swords of our warriors fell gently, like the lazy flight of a night owl," complains Warwick, Henry VI. Here the essence of the image is the movement of the owl's wings. Wishing to express the idea that Heinrich Bolingbroke tried to penetrate the heart of the crowd, Richard II says, "He seemed to dive into their hearts." Shakespeare's images, as we have already noted, reflect the reality surrounding the poet. In order to evaluate them, and sometimes in order to understand them at all, it is necessary to penetrate into the life of that era. One of the latest studies of Shakespeare's images, based on statistical calculations, concludes that most of Shakespeare's metaphors and comparisons are borrowed from the simplest phenomena of everyday life that he saw and observed. For the imagery of Shakespeare, the typical tendency is to revive the walking, extinct metaphor. The Duke in the comedy, Measure for Measure, does not speak of scourging laws, since this image has already lost its concrete meaning, as the coin of coins is losing money for too long walking, but about biting laws. Mature intent, opposed to the goals and aspirations of ardent youth, in the mouth of the same Duke becomes wrinkled intent. The most common, long-bitten speech turn is transformed by Shakespeare into a concrete image. "Words are only words," says the Doge in Othello, "I have never heard them reach a suffering heart." But this is not how he expresses this idea. The suffering heart becomes bruised. To reach the heart is to touch or, even tangibly, pierce it. On the way to the heart, words pass through the ear, and we get a typical Shakespearean turn. "Words are only words, I have never heard a bruised heart pierce through my ear." Comparison of slander with a poisoned arrow. Shakespeare could borrow from some ancient song. As though updating this image, he compares slander with a pernicious cannon shell. The same renewal of the ancient language motif is the name of the thunder, heavenly artillery. Here you can find points of contact between the style of Shakespeare and the style of Mayakovsky. The text of Shakespeare in his early works is full of pretentious expressions, euphemisms. But we have already seen that many said so in life. People in that era were theatrical then now. Much less bookish than it might seem. There were also names and images borrowed by Shakespeare from ancient mythology. In the quantitative respect, they occupied a very modest place in the works of Shakespeare, in comparison with the works of his contemporaries. In addition, most of the mythological images and names he used belonged to the most popular and public ones. Jupiter, Juno, Diana, Venus, Apollo, Hercules, swore by their names in squares and markets. During the court festivals usually arranged lavish masquerade processions, in which prominent figures occupied the figures of ancient mythology. The spectator of these processions was a crowd of people. Hercules was well acquainted with even the Weaver of Osnov, A Midsummer Night's Dream, although the latter also distorted his name. Individualizing the speech of the characters he created, Shakespeare seldom went by selecting a specific vocabulary for each person. An exception are some comic characters, for example, Lucio in the comedy The Mayor for Measure, whose speech is peppered with slang, jargon, dandies of that time. It is much more typical for Shakespeare to create a gamut of images that prevail in the speeches of the given character. For Othello, for example, the following images are characteristic: the skin is white as snow, and smooth as alabaster gravestones. Life, the flame of the lamp and the fire of Prometheus. Desdemona's sleeping, a living rose. The murder of Desdemona, the eclipse of the sun and the moon. He himself, Othello, is like that Indian who threw a pearl, not knowing its price. His tears over the dead Desdemona, the fast-flowing healing myrrh of Arabian trees. Absolutely in a different tonality, the images of Iago sound. The military theoretician Cassio, he compares with the book. The faithful servant is a donkey. People are jackdaws, that is fools. Life is a vegetable garden in which all sorts of vegetables and herbs grow, etc. Othello is poetic and his images. Iago is thoroughly prosaic. But even more significant is the fact that the speech of each of Shakespeare's actors has its own intonation. Each actor has his own voice. True, we do not always hear it, because the language has changed significantly with respect to its intonational sound. But in the 18th century, Rowan Popp pointed out that in Shakespeare we would always find out which of the actors speaks these words, even if there were no indications in the text. Shakespeare created a huge gallery of living beings. They are before us on the wide canvases of his plays, striking in diversity in the coverage of reality. Exalted monologues are replaced by grotesque wit. Above the grave dug for Ophelia, serenely merry grave-diggers will serenely serenade. On a terrible background of civil war, there is a tavern in which Sir John Falstaff is feasting. At the very tragic moment of Juliet's fate, comedians punish. Before us is a bizarre mixture of sublime and low, terrible and ridiculous, heroic and clownish. K. Marx and F. Engels, Works, Volume X, p. 13. In this wealth, philosophical, dramatic and poetic, a remarkable combination of depth and intelligibility, a brilliant unity of simplicity and complexity. This unity is the main force of Shakespeare as an immortal artist. What was its source? This was explained by another of the first connoisseurs of Shakespeare's text, the poet Alexander Pope, when he, with some sense of condescension, perhaps even contempt, if not envy, noted in the preface to the publication of Shakespeare in 1725 in the laconic and precise language, he appealed to the people,